Okay,
Just
so
volunteered.
I've got some questions about BP's application. So the environment plans were returned to the proponent with a request for more information on, I believe, 3 occasions. What was the new specific information that was required? And were any elements of the proposals rejected as unsatisfactory for any other reason other than lack of sufficient information?
Can I just clarify one thing? So we've had 2 submissions from BP. In the first submission, there were 2 occasions when we gave them an opportunity to modify and resubmit. They submitted a subsequent submission to us, and for that submission, there's been 1 request for further information. So it may just be a matter of semantics, but they have specific functions under the Act. So there is a request for further information out there at the moment with BP. They're due to respond by the 28th of October, and that request is still valid. They haven't yet withdrawn their application. We're conscious that the other party to the title, Statoil, has said it's prepared to proceed, and BP are looking for a buyer for the acreage. So at this point, it's still under consideration.
Okay. So just, if I can digress quickly, if that change of ownership goes through, is it Staff, did you say?
Statoil.
Statoil, if they become the sole proponent, or if BP manages to sell their share to someone else, and so there's a new dual proponent, will there be any assessment required of the fit and proper nature of the proponents?
Not by us, no. The legislation doesn't provide for us to make a determination on whether the party's fit or proper.
So just coming back to you said there was 2 opportunities for resubmission and then 1 request for further information. What was the specific new information that you requested?
Senator, we don't release those documents during the process, during the deliberative process, because it could actually influence the outcome of it. So at this point, that information hasn't been released publicly. Typically, they also contain the letters that go back to the company with those requests. Typically include reference to the environment plan, which isn't a public document until after approval's granted, on the basis that approval is granted. So at the moment, that information isn't publicly available.
Okay, thank you. So is that the same response to the reason for the opportunities to resubmit?
That's right.
In relation to the first submission?
The opportunity to modify and resubmit notification, the second one made for the first BP environment plan submitted, is published on our website.
Okay.
And we published an explanation of the reasons for the decision, which includes the criteria of acceptance that have not been met.
Okay, thank you. And the first one? Can you tell me anything about
the first submission? At that stage, we weren't publishing those statements, so one isn't issued just due to the commencement of that process earlier this year.
Sorry, could you say that again?
The process of us publishing the list of the criteria that we aren't satisfied with commenced in January this year, and that was after the first decision was made on the BP submission.
I see. So you only started releasing it after and you're not going to go back and release the decisions for that first?
On request, so through the normal process. Yep. No one's requested.
By anyone?
There are freedom of information requests that have been made to NOPSEMA about both BP submissions,
yes,
including our statement of reasons, and they're being processed at the moment.
Okay, great, thank you. So could an FOI also reveal the request for further information specifics?
Yes, there's an FOI request for that as well.
Before the approval was issued?
Yes, if they satisfy the requirements of the FOI, we will release it. Okay,
thank you. Great.
Equally, if the company chooses to release those documents, we have no objection.
Out of the goodness of their heart. All right, thank you. I'll live in hope. The 15-page oil spill response planning strategic overview, was that strategy accepted by NOPSEMA, or was there another more detailed oil spill response plan that was submitted?
That document wasn't submitted to NOPSEMA and is not part of the environment plan that was submitted to NOPSEMA. The regulations require an oil pollution emergency plan. I couldn't quote the number of pages, but it's definitely a lot more than 15 pages. Okay.
And when was that submitted?
It's part of the environment plan submission, so BP submitted it as part of their environment plan for the 4 wells in October last year, In the resubmission of that plan, after we gave them an opportunity to modify and resubmit, there was a resubmission of the oil pollution emergency plan then as well.
Okay.
And similarly with the new environment plan for 2 wells, the BP submitted, they also included an oil pollution emergency plan. It would have been different in every time because they were modifying and resubmitting it to address the requirements of the regulations and our feedback.
Okay, so the resubmission of the environment plan, which included the oil spill plan, was the resubmission required because of a request you'd made pertaining to the oil spill plan? Perhaps its inadequacy or its failure to address X, Y, Z?
As part of the assessment process, yeah.
You actually required them to resubmit the oil spill plan specifically?
Oh, not necessarily.
As distinct from it simply being a part of the broader environment plan?
Not necessarily. It's just the proponent's free to modify an application and resubmit it as part of that process. So I was just commenting that the document's resubmitted, but it isn't necessarily the same one, and it's at least not the one that's on the website.
So they resubmitted, but not at your request?
I don't have that information. I think the notification I referred to did identify that the implementation strategy wasn't appropriate, and the regulations in content relating to the oil pollution emergency plan is part of the implementation strategy.
Okay, thank you. What is NOPSEMA doing to include stakeholders in the consultation process for projects in the Bight, and why not make those full environmental plans public, as you would under the EPBC Act, for example, prior to the approval decision?
Okay, so under the regulatory regime, it's actually the responsibility of the companies to conduct the consultation. They have to come up with a submission, proposal that satisfies us. So as part of that, they have to be proactive in going out and identifying relevant persons, which includes environmental NGOs, fishing interests and other groups, if they're likely to be relevant. They have to provide us with copies of all of the correspondence and exchange that they have with those parties, and spell out how they intend addressing the issues that have been raised by those parties.
And that's just to you? That's not made public,
correct,
though?
yes, it's just to us. So the process is actually a more proactive one than otherwise would occur under the EPBC Act, where the proponent would otherwise just have to publish a notice in a paper or something like that, and the interested parties have to then see that and seek to participate.
I think it's probably a bit more broad for anyone to be able to make a submission than to have to be asked by a company to make a submission, but we'll perhaps agree to disagree on that.
Yeah.
Carry on.
The key thing being that the company is required to identify relevant stakeholders and approach them and get their views and inform us of that. Stakeholders also approach us directly through the process, and we'll have regard to that and raise issues with the companies, pass it on to the company, seeking a response from them. If we think there are legitimate issues, we expect them to address those issues.
Yes.
That may or may not be to the satisfaction of the stakeholder, but it needs to be to our satisfaction.
Okay. And so when you say the companies identify relevant stakeholders, do they have carte blanche to determine what's relevant, or is there some kind of geographic or interest-based?
No, there's not a geographic definition or anything like that.
They can say you're not relevant, only these people are relevant. Could they artificially narrowly constrain
the regulations specify who is a relevant person.
Right, okay, that's in the regs.
And there's
Thank you.
a relatively long list, but it's any person or organisation whose functions, activities or interests may be affected by the activity.
Activities or interests.
Yes.
Okay, interests non-pecuniary?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Now back to the second part of that question, which was what is the argument for not making that environment plan public prior to the conclusion of the approval process?
Yeah, the current regulatory regime doesn't provide for it. What it provides for is that in the event of approval, the company is required to publish what is called a summary of the environment plan within 10 days of the approval being granted. I say the term summary, in fact they're very substantial documents and comprise the majority of the environment plan.
Has that always been the case, that requirement to only publish post-approval, or is that a recent amendment to your Act?
No, that's how it's been. It's always been the case.
Keep going.
Having said that, we are on the record of having identified that as something we think there could be change in.
Okay.
and industry are divided on it. I note that BP did voluntarily release their environment plan at the start of this process, and also the department has been conducting a process looking at increased transparency.
Okay.
So we put in a submission, as did many other groups, including industry and NGOs.
Okay, and what's the timeframe for the conclusion of that transparency review?
The department's process?
if you know. Sorry to inconvenience
we're
someone
going to have
else.
to take
Just
that
a
on.
quick question,
We'll
please
have to
don't
take that on notice,
trouble
Senator
yourself
Waters,
if it'll
given
take too long.
people are not here. Sorry.
Just a rough indication will do.
No idea.
No idea. All right, thank you. Hi, Mum, bye, Mum. Okay, thank you. I'll follow that up.
I understand submissions
take
have
that on
closed,
notice.
so the department would be in the policy
Okay.
deliberations at this point.
Okay, thank you. Does NOPSEMA believe that exploratory drilling in the Bight can be carried out safely and that drilling operations can exist alongside protected marine parks?
Well, drilling has occurred in the Bight in the past. We haven't yet received an environment plan that satisfies us that it can proceed, but that's not to say that we don't believe one could be submitted that meets those requirements. If we receive one that does meet the requirements of the Act, we will approve it.
Okay, thank you. Now, in some jurisdictions, it's a requirement that critical spill response infrastructure and equipment, such as relief wells and capping stacks, be located in the same country, or at least be located in a way that can be mobilised as quickly as possible. I think the limit in the Arctic is 24 hours. The Gulf of Mexico is 15 days. Why is there not such a requirement in Australia to have in-country response equipment?
Yeah, I think for the Arctic, it's 48 hours. I was just over in Auckland the last few days, excuse me, talking to our counterparts from around the world. And the United States representative actually addressed this issue and said the situation in the Arctic is not a precedent for other areas around the world. The circumstances in the Arctic are quite different. The reason they needed to be so, to have a capping stack in close proximity, I presume that's the sort of equipment that you're referring to, is that in the Arctic, the area can ice over at rather short notice. The seasons can close in, so if they don't have a capping stack in the immediate vicinity, they can have problems which can't be addressed not only for a matter of days or weeks, but for a large number of months. So the circumstances are quite different.
Okay, and you think that...
In other parts, sorry, Senator,
Sorry,
but
carry on.
in other parts in the United States, they don't have that sort of requirement for 48 hours. It's more along the lines of the Gulf of Mexico, the
Yes.
sort of times that you've spoken about.
Yes.
And
So
in
why
other
is it a-
jurisdictions, far longer periods.
So why is there no time frame at all in Australia?
Well, it's not a case of there being no time frame. It's up to the companies to specify how quickly they would be able to mobilise a capping stack, and then we will consider it on its merits. And we will consider whether there are other alternatives that we think are reasonable alternatives that they should be implementing. And if
Okay.
they're not dealing with those reasonable alternatives, we won't grant approval.
Okay. So in relation to the BP application, I understand they were going to use capping stack that was located in Singapore with a 35-day capping timeline, which seems like an awfully long time to me. And my understanding is there's a test that you need to apply about meeting as low risk as reasonably practicable. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Was the 35 days going to cut it?
Well, that's we can't talk about the BP proposal specifically. If a company proposed 35 days, it'd be considered on its merits for the circumstances.
And would that pass
I
that
suppose,
test,
Senator,
in your
I
view?
might just add there that this has received some publicity, so it's something that attracted my interest, and I've spoken to BP about it, and I believe I raised it with Mr Smith as well, without prejudging their decision, because it's NOPSEMA's assessment. The rationale is that even if they had this sort of equipment in country or close by, it is would not have been able to be deployed any sooner, given other work they'd have to do in the event of that situation. Now that's their view. That was for NOPSEMA to assess, but just to give you the context of why they were proposing that time frame, that was the rationale that was provided to me. But obviously it's a matter for NOPSEMA then if it meets that as low as reasonably practicable test.
Okay, thank you. So if there was a totally unrelated company, or doesn't matter which company it was, that was proposing a 35-day time frame, would that meet the test of as low risk as reasonably practicable?
They would have to make the argument, or not?
They have to make the argument to us that the 35 days is as low as reasonably practicable in the circumstances.
Well, reasonably
we would
practical
then
according
assess
to
it.
what factors though? According to their own financial constraints, or according to the needs of the receiving environment? Like reasonably practical according to what?
Well, it takes into account a lot of factors, but I'll get Mr Grebe to
And
go into
if that's in the
detail
Act,
for you.
I'll just go read it, but if
Well,
not, then
in the
please tell me.
regulations, but ALARP is a principle established in the UK. It stands for as low as reasonably practicable, as you explained, and that is demonstrated by arguing that the costs of further reducing the risk or the imposts are grossly disproportionate to any benefit gained in improving and reducing that risk.
Okay.
So it's a case-by-case basis, and what is a LARP in one location may not be, in terms of, say, for example, duration and it takes to cap a blowout, may not be the same in another because the risk is different, or the
Okay.
costs are grossly disproportionate in that circumstance, but not
Thank you, I
others.
understand.
Two very quick ones.
Thank you,
Realise
Chair,
we're
for
holding
your
up hands
patience.
hard.
Given that the oil spill modelling that BP did demonstrated that the oil could reach the shores of all of our southern states in Australia, why was the consultation, particularly of the fisheries industry, not conducted outside of South Australia as well?
Well, it should be clear on what the modelling actually indicated. It didn't indicate that the spill would wash up on all of the southern states, for instance. The modelling that we've seen covered a whole range of scenarios which were then put together on a single map. So worst case scenarios. So for instance, the worst case scenario, if it was head towards Victoria, how far would it reach in one particular instance? Another scenario they would have modelled would have been if the prevailing conditions were directing all of the oil towards Western Australia, how far would it reach, and so on. And the pictures that we've seen in the media and so on are a combination of all of the worst case scenarios in all the directions. So,
Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah.
But why did that still constrain the consultation to South Australia and not to those potentially affected communities?
well, they did consult outside of South Australia
did?
as well.
Is that on the public record somewhere? Who they spoke to?
We have a record of who they've spoken to.
Are you able to share that on
Not
notice?
during this part of the
Right,
process, no.
same deal. Okay, we'll wait for that. And my final question, according to the National Offshore Petroleum Titles Administrator, Chevron's work commitment is the next most imminent project in the Bight, with 4 wells planned between July of next year and July 2018. Does NOPSEMA believe that it's possible for Chevron to consult meaningfully with stakeholders in that time frame and to demonstrate the safety and environment case in time to fulfil that work commitment time frame?
Well, at the moment, we don't have an environment plan from Chevron. It would be up to them to make that case to us. If I was to express a view now, it would be potentially prejudging a submission which we don't have.
All right. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate you staying back too. Thank you.